Asians, for example, they were marked, again, for Europeans only. A lot of their retiring rooms, benches, railway carriages, station retiring rooms, similar to the African-American segregation that took place in America. British also destroyed the Hindu religion. They ruined faith of both Muslims and Hindus, and they promoted Catholicism in India. They banned the practice of sati, which is the practice of burning a window. When the Indians complained about it, the British threatened those who complained. Maybe that idea was probably for the better, because burning widows is not a very good idea. They made a lot of money off the textile industry, and the Indians they just couldn't compete because, as we mentioned, the textile industry was shut down. They built up Indian infrastructure, as we know. That was one of the more better things that came out of that situation. In terms of the political impact, then eventually England took control, especially after the Sepoy Mutiny. So pretty much what happened, as economic problems increased for Indians under British rule, so did the feelings of resentment and nationalism, and kind of just, we don't like these people. Gossip spread among the sepoys, the Indian soldiers that were there to serve the British in their imperialistic aims in the East India Trading Company, to use the cartridges of their new Enfield rifles that had now been greased with beef and pork fat. To use the cartridges, soldiers had to bite off the ends. Both Hindus, who consider the cow sacred, and Muslims who do not eat pork, were outraged by the news because it would act them to go against their religion. This, along with many acts of racism, discontent, just awful treatment from England, provoked the Sepoy Mutiny. The uprising spread over much of northern India, and fierce fighting took place. Both British and Sepoys tried to slaughter each other's armies, and the East India Company took more than a year to gain control. The British then sent troops to help them. This led to direct rule and the Raj. The term Raj refers to the British rule after India came under the British Crown during the reign of Queen Victoria post-Sepoy Mutiny. A cabinet minister in London directed policy, and a British Governor-General in India carried out the government's orders. After 1877, the official held the title of Viceroy. To reward the many princesses who remained loyal to Britain, British promised to respect all treaties with the East India Company had made with them, and pretty much kept them happy, kept them in power, so they couldn't face up further rebellion. Meanwhile, guess who got the brunt of it? The poor people, the people who had been disadvantaged, especially the people who had led the Sepoy Mutiny. So that's how they gained control, along with other things that I mentioned there before. We talked about economic impacts of some of the situations here. And socially, again, a big part of it was the idea of Indians, similar to the way Americans viewed African Americans when they came over. They were dumb, they were subhuman, and they were just not right in a broader sense of things. All right, so that is what is going on in Japan. India. Now we turn to China and what happened there, and it was a pretty crazy situation. Yeah, so now we turn to China. A lot of stuff going on here, and it all starts. We're going to start off today by talking pretty much about this. So what was going on was, originally China was able to reject these consistent offers from the West to trade because it was largely self-sufficient. And the basis of this self-sufficiency was the incredibly strong agricultural economy that just made for a very stable country. Everyone was fed, everyone was happy, and everyone was actually very wealthy and increasing their wealth at a long time. And because of their self-sufficiency, the Chinese had little interest in trading with the West. For decades, the only place they would allow foreigners to do the business was at the southern port of Guangzhou. The European merchants, though, they were determined to find a product that Chinese would buy in large quantities. Eventually, they found one: opium. Opium is a habit-forming drug made from the poppy plant, and British merchants smuggled opium into China for non-medical use. Even though Chinese had been using opium for a long time for medical problems, China, pretty much what they didn't realize was it could be used for purposes of making you high, and it could be incredibly addictive, and the British knew that. They took advantage of it. They smuggled it in, and China was addicted. 12 million Chinese people were addicted to the drug by 1835. Awful situation there. Bad luck for the British, too, as well. After multiple requests from the Chinese government to stop selling the incredibly destructive drug were ignored by smugglers and British officials, the two powers fought the Opium War, which Britain won easily because of its incredibly powerful military. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed afterwards and gave Britain, this is pretty big, the island of Hong Kong, which is a huge foothold for China and a big part of China in terms of as a foothold for trading and to grow Britain's influence in the region. After signing another treaty in 1884, U.S. and other foreign citizens also gained extraterritorial rights, meaning that foreigners were not subject to the Chinese law at Guangzhou and 4 other Chinese ports. So they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. And it's very similar to if you are a foreign diplomat and you do something, you probably get away with it a little bit more easier because you have extraterritorial rights. So that was exercised quite easily. And the methods that they kind of used to maintain control were a little bit different because the Taiping and Boxer rebellions took place. So first about the Taiping rebellion here was the eternal problems that they face here were definitely growing. And during the late 1830s, Heng Shi Xuan, I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm not sure. A young man from the Guangdong province in southern China began recruiting followers to help him build the heavenly kingdom of great peace. In this kingdom, all Chinese people would share China's vast wealth, and no one would live in poverty, and the Taiping revolution began. Chinese word Taiping meant great peace. So that rebellion began putting obviously a lot of pressure on the Qing dynasty, and by the 1850s, Hong had organized a massive peasant army of 1 million people. Over the time, the Taiping army took large control of China, but Hong soon withdrew from everyday life, and finally, after attacks from Qing imperial troops and British and French forces, the Taiping rebellion was defeated. By 1864, this combination of internal fighting and outside assaults had brought down this government, but China paid a terrible price. This killed 20 million people, and it made it very, very hard for any substantial fight against the foreign powers to be lost, even though no one was really happy about it. And the way they kind of ruled was China had 430 million people. They couldn't come in and just colonize it very easily. It would just be too hard, too risky, not enough work, not very efficient. So what happened was they established spheres of influence. And it was the people involved were the British, French, German, Japanese, and Russians at one point or another. And a lot of people in this area were resistant to the change. And the change that happened was the British, French, German, Japanese, and Russians were all establishing spheres of influence. There are certain parts of China where they controlled all the economic activity, had special privileges in that particular area, and were easily able to trade with them. So this was something that was happening. A lot of people were not liking it. And during the last half of the 19th century, one person was in command at the Imperial Palace. The Dowager Empress, Cixi, held the reins of power in China from 1862 to 1908 with only one brief gap. She did support a lot of interesting reforms, including the self-strengthening movement. This program aimed to update China's educational system, diplomatic service, and key one, military. Under this program, China set up factories to manufacture steam-powered gunboats, rifles, and ammunition, which was it would be the right step in the right direction to maybe possibly take on foreign powers. Other countries were aware of China's continuing problems. Through the late 19th century, many countries attacked China. Treaty negotiations after each conflict gave these nations. China lost all these conflicts, and the winners got increasing control over China's economy. And these spheres of influences or foothold they gained were areas where, as I said before, the foreign nation controlled all trade and investment. So that was a big deal. So you have British, French, Japanese, Russians, and it was colonial influence. It was just all crazy stuff. And then the United States came in, and they were a longtime trading partner with China. So Americans worried that other nations would soon divide China into formal colonies and shut out all the American traders. To prevent this occurrence, in 1899, the United States declared a set of principles called the Open Door Policy that proposed China's doors be open to all merchants from all nations, not shutting everyone out into separate little spheres which the Americans had no influence in. That was something that they accepted. But this country, keep in mind, was very much at the mercy of foreign powers. So, the widespread frustration that was brewing in China over this foreign influence erupted into violence. Their campaign against the Chinese people's campaign that arose from a secret society of the righteous and harmonious fists, was what it was originally called, Then it became the Boxers, and then that formed the Boxers' Rebellion. In the spring of 1900, Boxers descended on Beijing, shouting "Death to foreign devils." The Boxers surrounded the European section of the city. They kept under siege for several months. The Dowager Empress expressed support for the Boxers, but did not back her words of military aid. Then a multinational force quickly defeated the Boxers once they finally were able to muster it up, and it would not be successful, the Boxer Rebellion. At this point, even the Qing court realized that China really needed to make some pretty big changes to survive, and by 1905, the Dowager Empress set up these areas to possibly study what was going on in the world, and they actually did try and make these reforms. So that'll be very interesting to see where China comes out of this whole situation, this whole colonial situation, when we pick up with them in future episodes. Now we turn to our last topic of the day, and that is Japan. Japan. The thing what was going on with Japan was they were pretty isolationist originally. And when Europe knocked, Japan opened to European trade because it wanted new goods, firearms, clocks, eyeglasses. Once they granted access, the Europeans tried to convert the Japanese poor to Christianity, which they did not like. So they quickly shut it down. And Japan feared European weapons and obviously the conversion of Japanese people to Christianity. Japan declared its act of seclusion, kicking the Europeans out. The Japanese had no contact with the industrialized world over this time. They continued, however, to trade with Chinese and Dutch merchants, but the trade was growing in importance inside and outside of Japan. This was called the Tokugawa Isolation. They really distrusted the foreigner for a long period of time. The Tokugawa government kept Japan in isolation for more than 200 years. And then, in the early 19th century, many Western powers tried to convince Japan to open its door. In 1853, Commodore Perry of the United States took 4 steamships to Tokyo Harbor. The technology and weapons on these ships were really kind of amazed and freaked the Japanese out a little bit. And so the Tokugawa shogunate realized that it really had no choice to give in to Perry's request, because Perry was like, if you don't open them, we're going to do this easy way or the hard way here. And if you don't open up these ports and trade with us, we're coming back, but with way more ships. And you get the idea there. So they did open ports. Eventually, the Treaty of Kanagawa was an 1854 agreement between the United States and Japan, which opened 2 Japanese ports to U.S. ships and allowed the U.S. to set up an embassy in Japan. The treaty was replied to the urging of Millard Fillmore, and the letter again did threaten to attack Japan with several steamships. So that was a little bit of a drawback there. So after this all rolled around, there were many reforms made after this, and a lot of Japanese people were worried that Japan would end up going the same way as China. Because the thing was, Japanese were really angry that the shogun had given in to the demands of the foreigners. So they turned to Japan's young emperor, Muchito, who seemed to really kind of symbolize the country's pride and nationalism. That was, they were very proud of being Japanese. So the Tokugawa shogun stepped down, ending the military dictatorship, because we do know there was a big difference between Tokugawa and the shogunate and the emperorship from Muchito. Muchito's reign lasted 45 years and was called the Meiji era. It was one of the rare times that the emperor actually had power in Japan, not the shogun. So this era, when Muchito took control of the government, he chose Meiji for his name, which means enlightened rule. And what he tried to do was he took kind of all the best things that he saw after he observed Western civilization, and he adapted it to his own country. He adapted Germany's strong centralized government. Japanese also admired German army and the skill of the British Navy. They attempted to imitate these European powers and modernize the military. The French helped them with that a little bit. They also instituted a military draft to build up their forces. They adopted American universal public education and required that all Japanese children attended school, resulting in greater literacy in Japan. Their teachers often included some foreign experts, which is pretty interesting. They also established medical schools to cut German and other Western medical practices. These new medical practices were huge in changing the way the doctors were educated and the way new patients were treated, and really some quite more effective medicine. The emperor also energetically supported following the Western path of industrialization, and Japanese economy soon had become